We can do that. Definitely the strawberries.
Oh, yeah, they're good.
Yes, they are.
This is our it's our fifth OWLS program, Older, Wiser, Livelier Seniors. You have, of course, before you the quality of the group, high quality people. Most of you have been to almost every program. Thank you very much. Next month we have our archaeologist down from Iowa City, and so come on out for that. But today we have a very special guest. His name is Steve Wilson. I met Steve probably about 5 years ago, when he came to do a program on wetlands for our 6th grade field trip, and brought with him ducks and geese, and he was a very popular presenter with the kids because of all that he had. And his story about his work is fascinating, and that's why we brought him here today. So I hope you will welcome Steve Wilson.
Good morning. Good morning, thank you. Beautiful day. I'm glad you got me out doing something like this for today. This is better than anything else I had planned. I'm Vice President of the Sanctuary Wetlands Association, and I'm involved in wetlands, as I've learned here this morning. Some of you are as well. And what I want to do is just kind of start at ground zero, talking about wetlands and what they are. And so can anyone help me define what I am talking about when I say a wetland? What is a wetland?
It's basically a marsh that its natural growth that it's lots of spaces there for birds and insects, and it's life.
Well, that's very well done. I can't do much better than.
And cleansing of the surface water through the wetland.
Okay, excellent. And she mentioned a marsh. Okay, and a marsh is one kind of a wetland, and it is the kind of wetland that I enjoy most. But we also have other kinds of wetlands. Can anyone think of another word we oftentimes use to describe a wet area other than a marsh?
Swamp, that's what I was thinking.
A swamp, yeah. And those two would be the most common in Iowa, would be swamps and marshes. And swamps are a little different than a marsh. When you picture a swamp in your mind, what do you see in a swamp that maybe you don't?
Cattails.
Oh, okay, now cattails may be common to both. A cattail may show up in a swamp or in a marsh, but typically the marsh is the emergent vegetation, which would be oftentimes look just like a field of weeds. Sometimes you can't even see the water in a marsh. But you get out there walking around in it, and you're up, almost to your knees in water. So the emergent vegetation, such as cattails, is the marsh, and so you were very correct in that. But the swamp has some of the larger plant species, the woody plant species. So when we think of the swamps like of Louisiana, where we've got those great big old bald cypress trees growing in there, that's a swamp. And in Iowa, we have swamps down along the river bottoms. Sometimes we'll have what we call a silver maple swamp, which is one of the most common trees. We also have swamps that have buttonbush in them. And I don't know if any of you are familiar with that plant.
Buttonbush?
Buttonbush is what they call it. In July, it has a very beautiful globe-shaped white flower that grows on the brush. The brush typically will grow at the highest to the ceiling of this room, usually far shorter, just being somewhat over head high. It makes wonderful wood duck habitat. Wood ducks love swamps. Now they enjoy marshes, but a buttonbush swamp is just about as good as life gets for wood ducks. It gives them an open area at the water level. And this is something different in swamps and marshes, and you see people canoeing, effortlessly through a swamp. Where in a marsh, they're going through there with one of those airboats, if they're going through it all, knocking all the vegetation down. Well, for wood ducks, they like the visibility. They like to be able to be on relatively open water where they can see around themselves, and then have the trees over their heads. And then two, they get this duckweed. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that, but if you look at a body of water covered with duckweed, you'd usually say, well, that's green moss. But if you dip your hand down into the duckweed and raise it up, then it looks like you have a whole bunch of little clover leaves, each one with a root hanging down. And that grows in the shade oftentimes in a swamp, and wood ducks love that. So we've got two different kinds of wetlands then, primarily in Iowa, that we're concerned with. We also have an occasional bog. We have some wet meadows and some fens, but swamps and marshes pretty well cover it. And with trumpeter swans, which are my favorite, and Canada geese, which I enjoy very much as well, the marsh is the favored habitat, as long as it's got some open water areas in it. And the muskrats help that happen. We got one of those too here. Yes, right here behind me. Yeah, and sometimes I enjoy them for making open areas, and sometimes they seem to spend all their time digging holes through the levees, so you have to rework your construction when you're in constructed wetlands. And that brings me to my next question is how are wetlands created? And what forces in nature come to mind when we think of wetlands? Where have our wetlands come from? Any thoughts on that?
Glaciers.
Glaciers were the big ones. Yeah, and our best wetlands in the state of Iowa were up on the kind of glacier moraine areas up in the northwestern part of the state. And of course those great ice sheets came down and leveled everything out and then retreated, and there was no well-developed drainage, and so you ended up with all these potholes, shallow lakes, and wetlands. Now, down in our part of the state, we're not quite so fortunate to have very many glacier wetlands. Most of our wetlands, rather than being up on higher ground, such as they are in the northwestern part of the state, are down on lower ground. So what makes our wetlands, what brings them about, other than bulldozers? Yes, and that's a crazy thing. Bulldozers got rid of a lot of them, and now it's come around the other way. So we're starting to see man creating wetlands with bulldozers.
What about beavers? Don't they make ponds and wetlands?
I just saw a beaver dam on the way here this morning. I was certainly surprised at that, right along Highway 34, not too far out of town. I should have marked the location. There is a beaver making a wetland right there in the ditch along the highway. So, yes, beaver are good constructors of wetlands and certainly deserve our recognition.
Oxbows.
Oxbows, excellent. And that's where really most of the wetlands that we have in southeast Iowa that have been naturally created have come from. Would be riverside. Either they're in the levees, the natural levees that occur along the river bottom next to the river, or in the oxbows. In Jefferson County, right next to Henry County, there's an oxbow lake we call, well, we used to call it Horseshoe Lake, but every oxbow is called Horseshoe Lake, so anymore we call it Rice Lake.
Excuse me, would you tell me what an oxbow is?
Excellent. What's an oxbow? Rivers, especially when they start to slow down a little bit, they begin to wind back and forth. And as they do that, they start making these loops.
Oh, like an S?
Yeah, like an S, okay? And then one day what happens is that there's a flood, and the water in its rush to get where gravity's taking it cuts across the S's and establishes a new channel that's straighter than the old. So now we have over here to the side an oxbow lake, which is an old curved river channel that's been disconnected then from the river. Then as the river creates natural levees in floods that follow, it builds dams essentially that dams off that old oxbow. And then we end up first with a lake, and then as siltation happens, the river floods again and again and again, it fills that in until we get a wetland. But of course, then that kind of brings me to, well, what happens to wetlands? We're talking about the forces that create them, and as is so often true with life, those same forces destroy them. This filling in the lake that creates a wetland also fills in the wetland. And in the process down along the river bottoms, what we have is we start out with a lake, and then as that lake fills up, why we have a wetland, oftentimes a marsh, and the plants that we have in that marsh in the river bottom, well, like down at Rice Lake, is the lotus, which are just, I think, are beautiful. The lotus flowers are those big, you know, the big flower, water lily. But then as it continues to fill in, then we go to Buttonbush, the Buttonbush swamp. And then as we continue to fill in, Then we get the silver maples, so we have kind of a progression. We'll get silver maples and willows and cottonwoods, and then as it continues to fill in, we may even pick up some of the bottomland oaks like swamp white oak, river birch, that kind of thing.
Is it proper to ask questions?
Oh, please, all the time.
If it changes so much, how does the seed or the root get in there so that the vegetation follows, from small to a larger tree?
And that's an excellent point. And how do we reseed? How do we start? And I'm sure with constructed wetlands such as you have, you will enjoy. One, you can bring the seed in and scatter it around at your wetland, and your wetland was made adjacent to a pond too that has some history of wetland plants, so they'll move into your constructed wetland quickly. Pardon?
I figured that.
Yeah.
But I'm planting 75 this afternoon.
Excellent. Okay, so there's one way they can get there, and that certainly saves time. But nature's way, of course, nature's way on some plants moves very rapidly. And when you look out here on the new construction of the highway, you'll see that they're creating small wetlands in the process. And what'll show up in the ditch along the highway within 2-3 years in those wet spots will be cattails. Okay? And so how do cattails get there so quickly?
The wind takes the seed.
The wind takes the seed down, and sometimes it's really beautiful to watch that, because down at our constructed wetland, we gathered cattails from around the state and farther. We're always watching the ditches for what we consider to be, extraordinary cattails. So then we stop, jump out of the car and run down and either dig up roots, depending upon the time of the year, break off the seed head and take it home and put it in the wetland. We're always looking for cattails that have really nice seed heads on them, okay? And we measure the seed heads, trying to get some that are like 14 inches.
Jefferson County has beautiful ones.
Oh, they certainly do. They certainly do. So, but those, when you plant those into a wetland and then you get in the fall when they're dry and the wind comes, it looks like a blizzard down there. The wind's blowing through that and the seeds are just going and going and going, just as if you were watching a blizzard. And so the wind picks those seeds up and carries millions of seeds all over everywhere. And the dispersal of seed, the testimony to how effective that is how quickly you'll see cattails colonize any new wetland.
Do birds at all use cattail seeds as food, or is it too small?
Cattail seed's pretty small. There's a lot of cotton and not much seed, so I can't say that they don't eat it. I just haven't seen them eat cattails. Now, I eat cattails, not the, well, yeah. In cattails, if you watch them in the spring, they have a male and a female flower. Now, when you see the classic cattail picture, you've got the brown flower head, which already has the cotton with the seeds on the outside. Above that, you have this stem, this bare, naked stem sticking up in the air. Well, previously in the spring, that stem had the male flower on it. And the male flower sheds pollen, a beautiful, bright yellow pollen. And you can wade out into your marsh in the spring and shake those cattail heads into a sack, and the pollen falls off in profusion if you're selecting good cattails especially. Well, then you can make pancakes out of that, the brightest yellow, most delicious pancakes, okay? Before the pollen starts to shed, you can cut those tops off and make like, it's kind of like miniature roasting ears out of them. You cook them like you would sweet corn. And then you put butter on them, and of course the cottony nature of it just soaks that butter up, so watch your cholesterol. Maybe you want to try low-fat margarine, but at any rate, those are delicious. Now, muskrats, of course, they love eating cattails. Canada geese love eating cattails, so there's a lot of things that do eat cattails.
Did
But
you learn this from the Indians?
the question was, did I learn this from the Indians? And probably yes, when you get right down to it. However, cattails also are in Russia, and they call the sprout, the young sprouts on cattails that come up in the spring, first thing. If you take those, dig those up out of the mud, cut them up into sections, those are delicious. They call it Cossack asparagus, and you can cook it just like asparagus, a white sauce if that's the way you like asparagus, and oh, they're delicious, they're good. So there is a history.
You better come back and cook us some of these.
Oh yeah, we could have a wild party. We could cook up a lot of wild things, and that would be one. And there's several in a wetland. When you think of a wetland, you think of life, and a wetland is just full of food. There's just no place that is a more bountiful ecosystem than a wetland. And so there's some of the foods that we like another one of the wetland plants that will show up before too long, is usually brought in by the birds on their feet, is what we call the arrowhead. Some people call it the duck potato. It's got a real nice tuber. You dig it up out of the mud and take the first bite. It's, terrible bitter. You know, it's like a green potato, only worse. You know how a green potato tastes. But you boil that, oh my goodness, then it's better than any potato. It's amazing transformation that takes place. So it's another good food plant. Okay, I'll have to kind of watch my clock here as I go. I can get going on wetlands and never stop. So I do have a film on the swans I want to show to you as well. So maybe we better move on to what I think is one of the most important aspects of wetlands, and that is the water quality. Okay, the effect that they have on water quality. We're used to thinking of water treatment in technological terms. So when we think of a water treatment operation, you know, we think of pumps and vats and pits and cranes and all this kind of equipment doing things in filters and that kind of stuff. When you look at a wetland, if you haven't thought about it, it may be kind of difficult to say, you know, well, what's the big deal there? How's water purification taking place? I mean, that's a mud puddle. Come on, water purification. So what I'd kind of like to do is to encourage you people to offer up some of the things that come to mind, what you see in your mind when I say wetland, you know, kind of word association here. It might be risky, we'll watch. Nothing Freud would like here, but something, you know, for us nature lovers. What you think of when I say the word wetland, and then I'll try to tie that into water purification.
A sponge.
Pardon?
A sponge.
A sponge. Okay, and that's excellent. So a sponge has to do with the capacity of a wetland to absorb water. So that's flood control, isn't it?
And the water goes down, so it filters down clearer than it had received it.
Okay, filtration would be another. So we got two things going on. We got the water coming in, and the wetland is slowing the water down. So now we got an opportunity for the sediments to settle out. And then we've got filtration. Now that the water has slowed down, depending upon the soil it's on, it begins to percolate down through the soil, and we get filtration there. Now there's an interesting thing that's happened recently. Out here there's a small wetland built on the top of the hill on the road that goes toward, what's the Methodist Church camp out there?
Golden Valley.
Golden Valley, thank you very much. Okay, on the way to Golden Valley there's a wetland built right on the top of the hill. It has water in it all the time. Now I've built wetlands down the river bottom, and I'm pumping water into them all the time, and when the guy said he was going to build a wetland up on top of that hill, I was like, oh, it's just going to be a dry spot. Okay, but it isn't, because the soil underneath that wetland is so tight, okay, that he's getting almost no filtration. It's holding the water right there. But there's other water purification things going on there. But down in the river bottoms, wetlands do an excellent job of filtration. In my wetland, I have to pump 100,000 gallons of water a day into a 3-acre wetland, and all of that water goes right down through the filter and into the groundwater and is purified in the process of that. So that's good. Anything else? Purification on wetlands.
Plants.
Pardon?
Lots of plants on wetlands.
Okay, you think of the plants, and the plants are certainly busy in that. The cattail is purifying water in several ways. One, it's taking oxygen down into the soil. And in the process of doing that, makes that oxygen available for biological processes to break down nutrients. Okay, the cattail's also obviously sucking water up into the plant. So we've got transpiration. Cattail's giving water back to the atmosphere, only it's pure water without the pollutants that were in the water. The cattail has bacteria that live on the stem. Those bacteria have been found to help break down some farm chemicals that occur in runoff water. So we've got, and then assimilation. Cattails love nitrogen, okay? They love to grow rank, oftentimes 13 feet tall, and just about like corn in their love for nitrogen. So when nitrates are a problem in runoff water, why cattails assimilate that, turn it into vegetation, and then put it in the loop okay, of the nitrate cycling that goes on in the wetland. So that's good. Plants are a part of what goes on there. What else do you think of when you think of wetlands?
Mud. Mucky.
Mucky mud. Okay. And the mucky mud is the mud that's usually full of the bacterial life that is a part of what breaks down. Say, for instance, in wastewater treatment wetlands, we can have solids come in, they become a part of that muck, then the bacteria begin to break those down, then the bacteria become a part of the food chain, and so pretty soon they're being picked up by insects. The insects are being eaten by the frog's being eaten by the bird, and so on. The thing that's interesting about the food chain is that also is a part of the water purification process. Because everything that eats food at the wetland that doesn't stay at the wetland has a tendency to move those nutrients out of it. So where nitrates and phosphates have a tendency to run into a wetland, okay, you'd have a problem there if they just build up there. Pretty soon you've got a polluted wetland. So how do you get those nutrients out of the wetland? Well, to some extent, bacteria can do that through denitrification, where those pollutants are given off into the atmosphere as pure gases. But in other cases, to get rid of the buildup of nitrates, the greatest way to do it is to turn it into a frog, feed it to a great blue heron, have the great blue heron fly from there to the rookery, and spread the fertilizer along the way, you know.
I was from my own drive here.
Okay. So we call that transportation, and that's one of the interesting things is that, you know, sometimes we don't appreciate how those animals, in living out their lives, whether it's coons or muskrats or great blue herons or the ducks or the geese or the swans, they're all participating in taking nutrients that are concentrated in the wetland and moving those out to other parts in the environment. Okay, let me catch my glasses here for a minute. I think we're doing, one thing I will mention. Sometimes when people think of wetlands, they think of mosquitoes, okay? And sometimes mosquitoes can be a problem, especially in wetlands that come and go. So if you have a wetland that is dry and then you get a flood in the summer and it fills full of water and then it lasts for, about a month and then it's gone, oh my goodness sakes, the mosquitoes you're going to have out of that wetland. But we've found that if we keep, and this is one of the advantages to constructed wetlands, especially if you go to the effort to get a good water source, if you can keep water in the wetland, you don't have near the problem with mosquitoes if water is there all the time. Why do you suppose that is? Any speculation as to why that might be?
Predation.
Predation, exactly. One thing you can have in a wetland is fish. I have mixed emotions about fish in wetlands because big-mouth bass have big mouths and eat wood duck babies, but you can have smaller fish in wetlands that prey on mosquitoes. But far more significant is the predatory beetles and the dragonfly larvae and the dragonfly adults that work the wetlands. And of course, too, the bats then that work a wetland if it's a continuous source of food. So mosquito control can take place naturally and go very well if you keep the water there, because then you keep habitat for the predators. But if it goes dry and then comes back, then you want to watch for mosquitoes. Another thing is that they have now biological controls for mosquitoes in wetlands. It's a form of the Bacillus thuringiensis. The same thing, that you put on your broccoli, for instance, if you want to keep those cabbage moths off your broccoli. A strain of that same bacteria can be used in a wetland to help control mosquitoes. So with those strategies, why mosquitoes usually aren't a big problem, but sometimes they can be. Okay. I think I'll move on to a tape that I've brought about trumpeter swans because one, we've had a report of 2 trumpeter swans on a constructed wetland, and I got to see the pictures more than a report. So the effort to restore trumpeter swans is gaining momentum in Iowa. It's something I've been involved in for some time, and it's been a long, hard go. But I want to share with you some of the successes that we've had in trumpeter swan restoration around the country, And then after that, I'll talk about some of the local challenges. So let's take a look here at the trumpeters. Okay.
Glides through the water. Its beauty has inspired writers, artists, and musicians. A symbol of elegance, but also of the ability to adapt. Once on the edge of extinction, the trumpeter swan has struggled and made a strong comeback. Valley on Vancouver Island, British Columbia is the home for the largest single wintering population of trumpeter swans in North America. After spending the summer breeding in Alaska, the trumpeter swan begins migrating south in September. When the freeze-up occurs in the tundra, the swans follow an instinctive route to the coasts of British Columbia and Oregon. The Comox Valley is the first abundant green space the swans find on their southern migration route. Once they discover the area, the swans return every year with their flock. It's an early morning in the Comox Valley. Wetlands, close to 2,000 swans spend the night. The swans will sleep atop the water in estuaries, sloughs, lakes, and rivers. The water offers protection and security, but a few swans will take shifts staying awake to stand guard. The trumpeter swan is one of 7 species of swans found around the world. The trumpeter is the largest swan, measuring 5.5 feet from bill to tail. The trumpeter swan can be found only in North America, with 70% of the population wintering along the coastal areas. Smaller numbers can be found in northeast British Columbia, Alberta, southwest Saskatchewan, Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana. 10% of the world's population of trumpeter swans spend their winters in the Comox Valley. Swan is a member of the family that includes ducks and geese. Some characteristics that these animals share include a flattened bill, long neck, long pointed wings, short tail, and short legs. But the swan is considerably larger and has a remarkably long neck. Its neck is as long as its body. Their wingspan may reach 7 feet, and an adult male weighs 28 pounds. But despite its size, the swan swims and flies gracefully. Does not affect the swan. Thick, water-repellent feathers provide insulation against the cold weather. Large, webbed feet set well back on their body make them strong swimmers. They use their long necks to feed on aquatic plants. Similar to dabbling ducks, they tip up to reach the underwater plants. The swans stir up the bottom by swishing their feet below the surface. Swans may come out of the water to eat grass and plants near the water's edge. They seem to lose their grace when walking, as their legs are so far back on their bodies they waddle. Four of the 7 swan species live in North America. All northern swan species have white feathers over their entire body. The trumpeter is the largest swan and can be identified by its all-black bill with a red border on the lower mandible. The distinguishing characteristic is its far-carrying, low-pitch, horn-like call. In the early 1900s, the trumpeter swan was hunted for its skins. The feathers were used in fashionable boas and powder puffs. In 24 years, the Hudson Bay Company alone sold almost 18,000 swan skins. Coupled with a reduction of natural areas for the species to live, the trumpeter swan population was in serious jeopardy. The number of swans was at an historic low in the 1930s, when fewer than 100 birds were counted in the United States. The trumpeter swan was considered an endangered species. For this elegant bird prompted efforts to protect the swans and their habitat. Lectures and advertising were used to educate the public, and part-time wardens were hired to protect the swans against poachers. For many years, the population was at risk, but the trumpeter swan has made a strong comeback. The Pacific Coast population has doubled in each of the last 3 decades, from 1,124 in 1959 to 13,459 in 1990. By banning hunting of the trumpeter, along with the swan's ability to adapt to winter feeding on agricultural land, it has survived and has been removed from the endangered species list. Rises over the horizon, the swans prepare to leave the waters. Groups signal each other by bobbing their heads. Nearing takeoff, head bobbing has escalated from mild dips to exaggerated movements. Then, at the same moment, the group crouches, pushes forward, and begins taking off. Takeoff can be tricky, as the swans paddle across the surface of the water with their feet and flap their wings to help them build up speed.
See those big rooster tails coming up in that muddy water behind you? Those big feet are the beginning of the wing.
Oh, it's marvelous.
They fly with slow but powerful wing beats with their necks outstretched. No other waterfowl moves as fast on the water or in the air. They cruise at speeds of 40 kilometers per hour. In the Comox Valley, these swans are heading towards farmland. The trumpeter will feed from dawn to dusk, and each can eat up to 10 pounds of grass per day. With up to 500 swans in one field, their presence can be either beneficial or damaging for the farmers. On vegetable farms, the swans feed on waste produce, potatoes, carrots, parsnips, and corn in the harvested fields. This prevents undesirable volunteer crops, disease, and pest outbreaks. But the swans can also cause permanent crop damage to grass fields by overgrazing and pulling out grass plants. Edgar Smith owns a large dairy farm and remembers the first appearance of 2 swans on his property in the 1960s. Over the years, the returning population multiplied until they severely threatened the grass crops used to feed his cattle.
Well, on this farm, when the number of swans got over 300 per winter season at their maximum, all of a sudden, the next year, our cows had no feed to eat. The grass didn't grow in the spring, and we were in trouble. How do you feed 600 dairy cows and 100 beef cows when your grass doesn't grow in the spring? So 300 swans on about 400 acres of grass, less than a swan per acre, was starting to cause us problems.
Local farmers began looking for a solution to the trumpeter swan agriculture conflict. In 1991, the Comox Valley Waterfowl Management Project began. Funded by Ducks Unlimited and the Canadian Wildlife Service, with the cooperation of local farmers, the program began to develop workable solutions that effectively manage the trumpeter swans. Funding is available to farmers to plant winter cover crops to lure the swans away from vulnerable grass crops. 500 acres are now an unrestricted source of food to the swans. Hazing programs are used to move the swans from valuable grass crops. These preventative measures can reduce the level of swan damage to fields.
We use the flags to discourage swans from feeding on the farmers' grass crops. And the flags act as scarecrows, and the swans feel uncomfortable landing amongst the flags placed in the fields. So if we place 1 per acre, they seem to work pretty well, keeping swans out of the grass fields.
A trained dog is used to quickly move the swans from an area. Obstructions such as these flags break up the field. Swans prefer large open areas to land and feed. Flags and barrels prompt them to move on. Decoy swans are set in the lure crops to encourage the swans to land. During the winter, swans will often feed in large groups.
They can be, to some extent, trained to a certain field. If we plant a crop for them to feed in year after year, they will learn that that's an area they can feed unharassed. But they do have changing patterns, so we have to keep following them around the valley and chasing them out of certain areas.
Noisemakers also quickly move the swans from fields. Through the cooperation of farmers and wildlife organizations, the conflict has come to a point which is beneficial to both the trumpeter swan and local farmers.
From my point of view, I found the program very, very successful. The year before the program went into effect, we were suffering about $175,000 feed loss in having to reseed our fields, go out and buy silage, go out and buy extra hay. We actually had to sell animals. We didn't have enough feed. The year following the Swan project, starting these lure crops and scaring techniques, we purchased no extra feed and had no damage to our grass fields.
The swan's survival now depends on the availability of agricultural land. Through purchasing local produce, the community can help the trumpeter swans by supporting Comox Valley agriculture. The trumpeter mates for life and travels in a family group. Adult trumpeter swans have snowy, all-white feathers. Juvenile swans, called cygnets, have gray plumage. A cygnet's bill has not yet turned fully black and has a reddish tint. By the time they return north in the spring, the cygnet's plumage will be mostly white and their bill will have darkened. The trumpeter is fully mature at 3 years. Healthy mothers, pens, incubate an average of 2 to 4 eggs, while the male, the cob, guards the family. At 4 or 5 months of age, the cygnets and their parents migrate south. The swans prefer feeding in wet, flooded areas where the grasses are moist. Moist grass also supplies more nutrients. To help digest the plants, swans eat small amounts of gravel or sand. This helps their digestive system grind down their food. Trumpeter swans have lived to be 29 years old in captivity, but in the wild they may only reach 15 to 20 years. Accidents and predators eliminate most of the birds. Overhead hydro lines were at one time a hazard to the safety of the swans. While entering or leaving fields, the swans sometimes hit the lines, injuring or killing themselves. Reports indicate that at least 10 swans a year were colliding with the lines. Yellow markers have been attached to make the lines noticeable to the swans. Since the marking of the lines, reports of collisions have been significantly reduced. The Comox Valley community is instrumental in the preservation of this species. Every Tuesday morning, volunteers from natural history clubs with the Trumpeter Swan Management Project conduct a swan count. These numbers are an important aspect of developing the swan management programs. Steph Nathan and Diana Maloff hike weekly into a local marsh to count the swans. They arrive before daybreak to catch the swans on the water.
104 is
185.
7. 187.
And the well, it's one of the resting places for the swans at night, and the marshes are being torn down and drained all over the country, and we really feel that it's one of the few important places around here where the other than the ocean, where the swans can rest at night.
This marsh happens to have such only private access, so the birds are not intimidated. There's nobody coming in and disturbing them.
There's nobody hunting them here.
Yeah.
20 minutes after sunrise, and most of the swans have left the area for local feeding grounds. Although the number of swans have been steadily increasing, Trumpeter Swan management groups don't fear overpopulation.
There's a lot of breeding habitat in Alaska left for them to expand into, so breeding habitat isn't a limiting factor, so they can reach maximum population growth possible. Each swan pair could perceivably fledge 9 young per year. And so that's quite significant. But the limiting factor is the wintering grounds and quality of food for them on the wintering grounds. Unless more land's made available or more crops are planted for them, they will continue to move further south. So in the individual areas, they probably won't increase too much in the wintering grounds. They'll expand to new areas.
The Comox Valley is fortunate to enjoy a mild climate. The climate is attractive to a variety of birds, including the swans. The valley has an abundance of open water and fresh food. Even if the temperature uncharacteristically drops, the majority of the swans stay in the area. This winter saw 1 week of unusual lows reaching minus 11 degrees Celsius, but 800 swans stayed in the area. Salt water keeps the estuary open, and with the cold weather, the swans spend more time feeding on aquatic vegetation, then move to the fields later in the day. Sunday at dusk, the swans move back to the wetland roosting sites. They announce their arrival with their loud call. Large flocks can be noisy as they move into the area. Through the winter, the swans will feed and rest, preparing for the journey back to Alaska. They begin their journey north in March. Successful breeding in Alaska depends in part on the quality of their wintering habitat. Swans returning to their nesting grounds in peak breeding condition have the ability to reach optimum cygnet production. The Trumpeter Swans comeback demonstrates that with sound management practices, species adaptability, and a widespread community effort, extinction can be avoided. What appeared to be impending doom for the trumpeter has turned into a success story.
This Comox Valley is in British Columbia, Canada, okay? And this flock of swans that winters there also winters in the United States on down the Pacific coast, as far as Northern California. Oh, the photography was beautiful, wasn't it? I certainly enjoy that.
Is it possible that they are able to live in saltwater or sweetwater region equally?
They need sweet water for drinking. But for roosting, they're especially brackish water. They're very comfortable resting on brackish water, which is, kind of salty, along in the estuaries on the ocean. So they do use that. And of course, the advantage to ocean water is it does not freeze as quick as fresh water does. So it gives them good roosting opportunities, but they do need fresh water to drink.
Now, do we have a fly zone of trumpeters here in Midwest? I mean, where we are?
We certainly wish we did, and every time we see a trumpeter show up somewhere in Iowa, we're approaching that. There's currently an effort, a statewide effort, as well as an individual effort on the part of many individuals to reintroduce the trumpeter swan to Iowa. Trumpeter swan reintroduction programs in Minnesota have been successful, and some of those birds are beginning to migrate, and some of those are migrating through Iowa. And some of the birds that the Iowa DNR has released have begun to move around the state. So yeah, we're starting to see trumpeters again in Iowa.
Isn't there a program near Burlington? There is a little lake there trying to raise trumpeter swans?
Well, yes, but they're, and I'm not sure how Henry swans are going right now. There was an effort at the Iowa Army ammunition plant there in Middletown to raise swans there. That's pretty well been abandoned, I think, at this point. Henry Bolin down there has worked with the swans, and we in Mount Pleasant have been working with the swans. And I've got a little short tape here I can kind of show you as to how we kicked that off nearly, I think 10 years ago now. And it's a program we continue with. We've met a lot of obstacles, as have the DNR. It's the swans are more difficult than Canada geese to reintroduce. And I think one of the significant things that comes out in that video is the cooperation that's necessary on the part of the community and the farmers and community conservation groups to all get together and to welcome the swan, and then it can be beneficial for everyone. But it needs that kind of cooperation, because every living thing has a footprint, and swans, if you notice, they've got a big foot as far as that's concerned. So they have needs, and we have to find ways to factor those needs into our lives.
How long have you been working with wetlands in general? You enjoy?
Well, it began 12 years ago. I guess we could most accurately say in an organized fashion. I've always loved to play in the mud. My mother had trouble with me from day one on that, I think. So I can't really say, when did I become interested in wetlands? It's, whenever I could get away from home and get into one, I was interested. But 12 years ago, Joy came home from a pigeon swap with 3 Canada geese. And one of those is still with us. We call her Squirt. There was Dauber and Dandy as well, and just this year we lost Dandy. But these birds certainly endeared themselves to us. And so from that, why our interests grew, and we expanded to other geese as well, snow geese and little Richardsons, the small race Canada geese. And then with Henry's encouragement, we went on to the Trumpeter Swans. And so we've been in the Trumpeters, I guess we were into the geese for a couple of years before we got into the Trumpeter Swans. And so it carries on. We also feed a wintering flock of Canada geese at our house that flies back and forth between our house and Oakland Mills. So they roost at night at Oakland Mills, and then they come to our house to eat. And this year we had around 600 of them, so we had several wagons full of wheat and corn that we fed them so that they could stay at our house on open water. We keep the water open with a bubbler and feed them, and then they fly back to Oakland to nest. So that's something we enjoy doing.
How much acreage do you have?
The Sanctuary Wetlands Association Wetland and Trumpeter Swan rearing pens is on a relatively small plot of about 10 acres. And then we own some additional personal holdings. But there at the house, it's really a very small pond. We had to sacrifice grass for geese, you know. It was just one of those decisions we had to make. But we can lay in our bedroom and look out those big picture windows and watch geese come in for an hour in the mornings in the winter. And we couldn't see the grass at all, it'd be under the snow anyway. But that treat of watching the geese just keep coming in and coming in is something that we've become addicted to. So.
Now you told me one time about working with wood ducks and raising wood ducks. Do you have a place just in the house that you're incubating these ducks, or do you have a garage you work out of? Or?
Well, the wood ducks have been one of the really rewarding things that we've done. Now, of course, when we have a wood duck up here on the wall, a specimen that's been mounted, and they're certainly one of the most beautiful ducks in North America. We wanted to become more involved with wood ducks, and so I can remember once when I was a kid, I grabbed some baby wood ducks off of a creek and brought them home to raise them. That ended up being a real tragedy for the wood ducks and for me. Wood ducks are born crazy, just as wild as can be, and so they would not eat, they wouldn't drink. All they wanted to do was to hide from me. And so it wasn't long before they were dead. After Joy kind of got things kicked off with the Canada geese, why then that got my mind turning. Maybe wood ducks are possible, you know, so I started looking at what was available at the pigeon swaps and whatnot, and there were people successfully raising wood ducks. So we bought some wood ducks and clipped their feathers so they couldn't fly, and gathered their eggs and incubated the eggs and had little wood ducks. We raised them successfully, but it wasn't a pleasant experience. As soon as they hatched, they were still scared to death of us. And like if there was a sick duck, Joy would reach into the pen, take the duck out and hold it to try to soothe it, you know, and instead it died of fright in her hands, and she's like, I don't need this anymore. You know, every time I try to feed them or water them, they just run to the back of the cage, pile all over each other, climbing like mice up the wire, trying to get away from you. And so she said, that's just enough. They're certainly cute little fellows, but it doesn't make you feel good. So I said, well, let's try one more thing. Let's try imprinting the baby wood ducks in the egg. Because I said, something's got to be going on where these wood ducks get along with mother. Maybe she talks to them in the egg. So that's what we did next, is for the last 5 to 7 days of incubation, you know, take the eggs out 3 times a day, each egg, beep, 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 you know. You feel kind of like an idiot, but you get the swing of it after a while. We got some help. We took eggs to school. Kids love that. You know, 3 times a day, pull the eggs out of the incubator and talk to them, you know. So we gave that a try. When the first time that I did that, when the wood ducks hatched, I opened the door on the incubator, and the wood ducks immediately ran to the back of the incubator and piled up against it, just classically, you know, and I thought, well, this is it. This is the end of raising woodies. But then I went, beep, 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 and oh, it's Mom, and proof, out to the front, you know, this is the guy. So I took them then out in the front room and laid down, you know, and they just crawled all over me, and it was like redemption from killing those 3 babies when I was a kid, you know. So we were a little concerned then, though, that with Canada geese and trumpeter swans, if we hand raise the birds, they imprint on us, become too friendly to people, don't have an appropriate respect for people, and therefore get in trouble, landing in parking lots at Walmart or things like that, you know.
Are bulldogs on the danger list that you went through all the trouble to try to raise them?
Oh no, they aren't endangered, they're just beautiful.
Oh,
That was the thing, and we just wanted to see if we could establish a better working relationship between wood ducks and people. No, they weren't, they are not endangered. But the nice thing about them too is that the imprint on wood ducks is transitory, that they have an initial imprint where they imprint on mom and dad, or actually just on mom, and then they imprint again on peers at the time that they fledge and fly. So what this means is that once the ducks can fly, they become afraid of us, which works out very well. We can release the ducks just about the time that they're ready to fly, put them on the pond, and from that time on, we walk out the door, those ducks take off. Okay, and that prepares them far better. Where Canada geese and trumpeter swans, you imprint them on you and have them follow you around. You walk out the door, they come up to see, hey, you got anything to eat, or you want to chat, or that kind of stuff, you know. So that makes it kind of a problem. Now, one of the great things that's going on right now with trumpeter swans is they're imprinting them and having them fly behind ultralight aircraft from the area where they were hatched to safe wintering areas. This is one of my dreams, you know. Someday I'm going to win the lottery, and when I do, there'll be this ultralight that'll fly trumpeter swans from Iowa to Arkansas. And so what I want to do is, I've got a short tape here that'll kind of give you the history of that, and then our time will be pretty well running out. But if any of you want to stay over after this tape and ask questions, as you can well tell, I never tire of this, okay? It's at times like this when you're wondering, oh, I did rewind that tape now, didn't I?
About 100 years ago this year, the last pair of trumpeter swans was recorded as nesting in Iowa, and so since that time, they've been extirpated or exterminated. And now this is a good time, I guess, to go to work on it. You guys want to go for a walk? Come on, Swannies. Come on.
Steve Wilson's Swannies may be at that ugly duckling stage now, still thinking he's their mom, but these waddling little cygnets are Iowa's future hope.
Yeah, hey, that's going to feel good, isn't it? Yes.
Once hunted for their fuzzy plumage, these baby trumpeter swans are part of the Sanctuary Wetlands Project, an effort to bring North America's largest waterfowl back home, even if it means teaching them to fly south.
We're going to truck the birds back and forth between Arkansas and Iowa until they've nested successfully in Iowa. So the destiny of these swans that we're looking at here, we hope, is to be the first trumpeter swans to migrate again between Arkansas and Iowa.
Hatching high-flying ideas in the midst of a flap just comes naturally for Wilson. He's been a feathered friend of Canada and snow geese for years.
Steve isn't alone in his efforts to raise these little guys. He has had some expert help.
My dad found out that one day that they'd come after us if we went.
Nick Thornburg is part of 2 fourth-grade classes here and in Arkansas that raised $700 to adopt their own hungry cygnets.
Well, one reason because I thought it would be fun raising them, and the other because I kind of wanted the trumpeter swans back in Iowa.
For Nick and Swannies, classmates, it'll be tough to send these downy cygnets south in September. A real bird bond is developing through hands-on education.
It's just amazing, the response. They were all just ears and eyes, and they just wanted to be next to those animals, just to get close to them. And I think that's really what we wanted to accomplish is for them to have some empathy for these birds.
What I love about waterfowl is just the way that they celebrate life, the air and the water, and you mix that together with kids, and it just makes this a whole lot of fun.
But everyone agrees the biggest thrill is still about 4 years away when great white wings bank north and soar into a spring sky.
Yeah, that first time that they fly from Arkansas to Iowa, boy, that's going to be some deal. There's no doubt of that. That'll be great. 7.5-foot wing spread coming in and landing on one of these little ponds. That'll be fun to watch.
And you can bet Steve Wilson and his friends will be here to trumpet their Swannies' return. In Mount Pleasant, Iowa, Matt Hamill, News Channel 8 Earth Alert.
That's wonderful.
Okay, well, our time says that it is up, so officially anybody that's got anything else going on today is obviously free to leave at this time. And anybody that wants to remain and chat about wetlands or waterfowl, why certainly feel free to do so. And we do have strawberries over there that need eaten yet, and I don't think we're out of tea or coffee, so feel free to stick around. Thank you.
Have you had the birds migrating yet between?
No, we haven't. No, we haven't. It's been a long road. We did truck birds to Arkansas. We did that for 2 years, and then we had a reaction in the flock to medication and ended up losing half of the birds over that. So since that time, we've been attempting to rebuild the flock. We've had some successful nesting. I do have some pictures here you can look at of some Henry County born trumpeter swans. And we do have some swans now that are ready for release that we'd like to just kind of let go on their own. The success of ultralight aircraft for imprinting migration routes so exceeds the success of the trucking strategy that I think when we get the numbers that we need build up again, then that's what we'll try.
How many years have you been doing this?
The trumpeter swans is 10 years, I believe, that we've been working with them.
Yeah, because your beard was almost black.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, and I think maybe raising trumpeters has contributed to some of the white hair, but...
I think that you're one of them, you know, the Cattail white.
There you go. That may well be. I've been accused of being a reincarnated trumpeter swan, and I don't believe that, because when I watch them fly and land like that, I'm so envious. And if I'd ever come to a skiing stop across the water like that, I don't think I ever would have forgotten it, you know. So I don't know about reincarnation, but that'd be more something I'm looking forward to, I think. And it'd sure be great to at least spend one lifetime as a trumpeter swan.
That's wonderful.
Do you work with other wetland species aside from waterfowl?
We've done some work on box turtles, which are not really a wetland species per se, but we have an area that's fenced in from predators and kind of can keep the box turtles there, and we've lost box turtles pretty well in Henry County, so that's one thing we looked at. We're obviously interested in wetland plants and also amphibians. We keep pretty close tabs on what frogs are singing in the wetland, but wood ducks, Canada geese, and trumpeter swans are the featured species. That's where we spend most of our work. But in the spring, to go down there when the chorus frogs and the cricket frogs and the tree frogs are all going, I certainly enjoy that. Can't hardly hear yourself think down there.
Is it possible to come and visit your reserve?
Well, that's an area that we're going to work on. We on special arrangements have had tours where we have a hay rack. The wetland is down a half-a-mile dirt road. So what we do is we put the kids on a hay rack and pull them down there with the tractor, and then we go look at the wetlands. for the seniors, why there's more walking sometimes than what some people are comfortable with. So we've wondered what we might do to help that. And recently I gave a presentation to the Henry County Bird Club, and those folks definitely want to get down and see the swans. So we are going to create a way to make that happen, and we'll publicize that. But it's not, there isn't public access. I mean, you can't just go there and go down to see the swans at the present time.
I have a foolish question about wetlands. You said if you walk into it, you're all of a sudden sink. Is it possible to compare it like with quicksand, that if you are not careful, you can really sink down and get it?
I really had no experience with quicksand other than falling in love with waterfowl. So I do get in the mud in the wetland, but quicksand, it's my understanding, develops if you have a spring where water's coming up through sand, and it has a tendency to essentially boil the sand, and therefore if you go out into it, why then whoosh, down you go, and you have to essentially swim out of it if you can. So in most wetland situations, there wouldn't be quicksand, but if you've got a pair of boots that are a little too big for you, and you're out wading around in the mud in wetlands, now that's bad. Pretty soon you don't have boots on. They're stuck in the mud or down in the water, you know, and you're barefooted, so.
But in other words, you can get out of it, even so if you sank into it, it's...
Oh, yes.
You can walk out of it.
Oh, you can always walk out of it. More or less muddy and wet, but you can always walk out. Yeah, right. Yeah, well, I wouldn't take you into any place that would be dangerous that way.
So many different species of birds, you must have smaller birds too. You know, the regular migrators do go through your...
Oh yeah, and that's a delightful part of wetlands, is just to watch the different birds that come. The little rails were something I just, you know, you see about rails, but you just almost never see them. Mm-hmm. And since we've created the wetlands, we see them. They're like little bitty chickens is what I compare them to. So they show up. Also, we see the egrets, and we've got a great blue heron rookery that's come into existence next to our wetland now, and I think there's like 10 nests in a great big old sycamore tree now that's developed over the last 4 years. So there is a lot of species of waterfowl, ducks, especially the teal, the green-winged teal, the blue-winged teal. Blue-wings really love wetlands, so they show up, and the wood ducks and the mallards. And so yeah, there's a lot of other birds. They say about 300 species of birds depend on wetlands to some extent in their life cycle in North America. So if you create a wetland and take care of it just in terms of allowing there to be a diversity of habitat and some protection, why, you'll see a lot of birds. There's no question about that.
Is there an acreage of a wetland that's best? Like they say, if you want to have a wetland, you should really work with 3 acres or 5 acres or 10. I mean, what's the...
It just depends so much on what your target is, the size of your wetlands. A lot of people anymore, and I certainly encourage it, create these little water gardens in their yards, and they'll plant some wetland plants in there, you know, and then the next thing you know, the toad's saying thanks, and you've got tadpoles in there too. So a small water garden can be a wonderful wetland and a wonderful way to begin to learn about wetland plants and the smaller critters that live in wetlands. Then when you get up to somewhat larger wetlands where you're talking about an acre to say 5 or 6 acres, you've got really good habitat for the ducks that'll start showing up and using your wetland. Trumpeter swans, left to their own, would like to have a large nesting area. Now they're willing to use Iowa ponds because they're isolated. They're going to be the only pair of birds that nest on that pond, at least in terms of swans and usually in terms of geese. So if you have a relatively small pond but it's isolated, say just a half-acre pond, just like a pair of Canada geese might nest on it, so too might a pair of trumpeters. If you had a large wetland, say you had a 1,000-acre wetland, you'd probably find that trumpeter swans would space themselves out, and there wouldn't be more than one pair on every 80 to 100 acres. So optimally, that's the kind of habitat that they've required. Trumpeter swans don't have a lot of predators in the areas in which they do very well, the large wetlands in Alaska, for instance. And so they do have behaviors that are self-limiting, and territorialism is one of them. So rather than relying on predators to keep their numbers in check, they rely on their own territorial behavior to keep their numbers in check. So that's something to keep in mind. You have 2 pair of trumpeter swans on a small body of water in the spring, and you've got to fight. That's what it amounts to.
The male naturally does the fighting that I feel. Does the female ever get into that?
That's not a loaded question, is it? The pair, I would say that the cob typically is more aggressive than the female. And that especially during the nesting time, when she's more apt to stick to the nest and he's more apt to chase after anybody that comes. But before she sets, the pair will pursue any interlopers on their space. And so during that time, I think that the pins are probably about as aggressive as the cob. So there's something to think about with small children. As we begin to welcome the swans, we have to understand their space requirements and that they have needs. You know, when this one goose that I love so well, Dandy, that just died this year, a wild gander mated with her and they nested on my front step. And no matter what it said at the courthouse, her mate, Damien we called him, owned my house. There was just no question in his mind at all he owned my house. So when I came, he would grab me on the leg, kind of like you would grab somebody by the collar if you were going to hit him, you know, and he'd hold on to my pant leg and then he'd come back with his wing and hit me, okay? Yeah, and I loved him anyway. He and I agreed Dandy was the most wonderful goose in the world. And in Canada geese, you see they're even more inclined for the gander to be the aggressive bird, I think, than in the trumpeter swans. But trumpeter swans also own the piece of land, the piece of real estate upon which they nest. You need to understand that in terms of nature, their sense of ownership is just as valid as ours. So when we see that they have a space, we need to respect that. And so small children, and probably many of you know, like with domestic geese, you know, you don't want small children bothering domestic geese where they're nesting. And same thing with trumpeter swans. You'd have to say, hey, give them their space. You stay away from them. But in my experience, they're less aggressive than Damien. I mean, I'm able to go up to the nest, you know, but they see me on a regular basis. But I've never been attacked by a trumpeter swan. But I've heard stories of people who have been, so. And they're aggressive. They could do it.
Do you think that the trumpeter could hold their own against like a coyote or a fox if they would approach him or not?
Trumpeters can be death on muskrat. I've found dead mink in the trumpeter pin before. Coons come into the trumpeter pins and never bother the birds themselves, but will eat the eggs in the nest if they catch mom off the nest. Coyotes will prey on trumpeter swans. We haven't had any coyotes get in our enclosure. We haven't experienced that loss. But coyotes and dogs are effective predators on trumpeter swans. Yep.
Can't they just fly away?
Can the swans fly away? Well, and that's where that option exists. I mean, obviously, just like when that dog in the film you saw, when they sent the dog out to chase the swans, yeah, the swans took off where they can. But of course, swans, like all waterfowl, go through a flightless period, and then young swans, of course, can't fly. So the parents then have to do the work in trying to protect young birds or themselves in flightless times, and especially when young are involved. Why, the swans would attempt to hold their own against dogs or coyotes, but depending upon the size of the dog and its determination, they may or may not be successful. Dogs kill swans. I mean, you know, that's...
Coyotes usually go in at least a pair or 2 or 3, 4, so it's outnumbered.
Yeah, and I think now this wetland that has an island in the middle, oh, those are so wonderful for the birds, because that gets a safe place for them where coyotes typically don't want to come through water and deal with something like a trumpeter swan, and even coons are less apt to. So nesting islands and wetlands are a wonderful way to reduce predation. If you don't have an island, but you have a pond that you want Canada geese or trumpeter swans to be successful nesting on, well, you can fence the pond in and fence in some grass adjacent to it so they've got room to graze. And that'll keep them there as long as the goslings can't get through the fence, why mom and dad will stay. And the same with the swans. So you can contain them and give them a certain degree of safety.
But you know, I'm surprised that you are raising Canada geese when they are so many all over that they're really becoming a pest.
Whether or not Canada geese are a pest, I guess, depends upon who you are. You know.
Well, if I am a golfer and the Canada
Exactly.
geese covers the golf course, you know.
Exactly, and I think your point is well made in terms of these trumpeter swans, because when the trumpeters first showed up in the Comox Valley, the trumpeters ate the farmers' grass, and so too might they have been a problem on a golf course. So the community, in an expression of consideration for the birds, developed programs to control the birds. And so what looked like too many trumpeter swans at the beginning, where he was experiencing a loss of feed for his cattle, $175,000 a year, ended up not being too many as soon as they began to make habitat for the birds and began a hazing program, began to train the birds as to where their place in the world is. And I think that that's the kind of thing that needs to be done too with the Canada geese. People will have a tendency, Canada geese show up on their pond, they think it's wonderful, they start to feed them. And then the next thing you know, you've got goose poop on the patio. And so if you don't have tolerance for goose poop on the patio, then don't try to make friends with the geese, don't feed them, and those kinds of situations are less apt to develop. So, do I think there's too many Canada geese? Not yet. Not yet. But I don't think there's too many snow geese either. So it takes a lot of geese for me to think there's too many. When I go down to Arkansas and those snow geese come in just like like a cloud front and land down there in that winter wheat field, you know, tears come to my eyes, and so too to the farmer, you know, for different reasons. So are there too many Canada geese? Too many snow geese in that situation? I'm like, wow, no, not at all. This was awesome. This is like seeing the mountains, you know. Yeah. And but the farmer who's having to struggle with nature to make his living from it doesn't need to be confronted with that show of force and doesn't gather the same experience from it. So that's where I think this program is so neat in the Comox Valley, is because they've owned that, and they've said, rather than just saying, you know, there's too many swans, they've said, let's manage the swans, and let's establish places where they can go and places where they can't go, and train them to know the difference. And I think we failed miserably at that with Canada geese, because we've got I can go out here and find nice wetlands in Henry County, for instance, Jefferson County, and there's no geese on them. No geese on them, okay? And then I can go to the city of Chicago, to maybe Motorola's corporate office, and there's a pond there, and there's 100 geese.
Oh, you don't have to go so far. Go to Ottumwa.
Go to Ottumwa, okay, in the park, okay, and there's all of these geese, and I'm saying, okay, what's gone wrong here? Why aren't the Canada geese out on the wetland? Why are the Canada geese in the golf course? Okay, and the reason is because golfers are not nearly as good a shots as hunters are. Okay, and so the geese are not threatened by the golf balls. Okay, and they get shot at occasionally with them, but they're definitely threatened by the hunter in the wetland. So when they were talking about the trumpeter swans, and they said, well, we have this wetland, this place where they're staying. And she says the important thing is they're not harassed here. Well, even if you have hunters at that wetland that are shooting whatever, the swans aren't going to stay. Okay, so we need to establish, and this is the value, that's why there's a Sanctuary Wetlands Association, is we need sanctuary wetlands, places where, when the geese come there, that's their place. Okay, then they'll be there. Then if you want to hunt geese, go to Chicago, go to Ottumwa, go to the golf course. That's where we need to hunt the geese and train them. You guys don't belong here. But the places where they do belong, that's where they need to find a refuge. And so that's kind of our philosophy. And it's a part of the problem because, and that's one of the things Joy has commented on, since we've created a refuge, essentially become a refuge, even on a small pond, we're there and there's all of these birds. And she says, isn't it interesting we can drive all around the county to far better habitat and there's no birds on it, you know? And that's what we have to do. We have to learn how to respect the critters' need for a safe and secure place to be. And when they're in that place, they need to know it. And when they're not in that place, they need to know it. And so the dogs, so the flags, so hopefully the organization of wildlife management, so that if hunters want to hunt snow geese, do it in that winter wheat field. Okay? Don't do it in the marsh and in the wetland where the geese need to be and where they don't create a problem. So that's part of our philosophy, but we don't mind goose poop on our our back step. We consider it a mark of honor, but that's just us.
So geese and ducks and swans, do they all get along on one pond or?
Depends upon the time of year, whether or not the ducks and geese and swans all get along on one pond. If you noticed, this was wintering swans, and while they were taking those pictures, you probably saw that there was a lot of ducks on the same water, and they're sharing the same water with them. I can show you pictures of the wintering swans in Monticello, Minnesota, which is where the biggest wintering flock of swans in the Midwest is. And there's Canada geese and ducks right there with them, getting along fine. In my swan pens at home, wood ducks come in and eat with the swans, so do the teal, but not Canada geese. Once you get that big, the swans draw the line. So we've had some rather severe lessons in that, I suppose, because if in an area where Canada geese are nesting, swans will destroy their nests. So it's that's kind of the decision-making process people need to think about, you know. If you welcome the swans, so to speak, then you're not going to have the geese, probably. And that's been used, too, as a management tool, because swans, being very territorial and wanting their own piece of water in the spring, will drive off the Canada geese, typically, okay? And then you just have a pair of swans to put up with instead of 25 Canada geese maybe eating on your grass. The only problem with that is just as soon as you try to use that to your advantage, it's like they change the rules. So the idea that you can use swans to manage Canada geese is limited. Sometimes it works very well, sometimes it doesn't. We notice a difference in swans. Some swans get along with everybody, and some swans don't get along with anybody. You know? Just like people. Again and again, that's what I say about swans. They're just like people. And the same thing on mating. I mean, some swans mate for life, and that's just what they do. And they lose a pair, they don't, they lose their mate, they don't mate again. And they go back to that same nesting spot and just sit there alone and own it, and that's what they do. Some swans come back to the wintering site with a different mate every winter. You know, so...
How do you know that? Do you tag them?
Banded birds, the study of the banded birds. So, again, they're just like people. You know, some are true blue and some are you'll do. So, there you go.
Are you going to write a book about all this one of these days? Or already done so?
I haven't written a book about all of this. You think I should?
It'd be wonderfully humorous, too.
Well,
Everything in it. Science and humor.
Yeah?
It'd be great.
Well, my sister says I should. I wrote a swan log for a while, which was a newsletter about what was going on with the birds. And my sister certainly enjoyed that, but she's trying to make up for how she abused me in my early childhood, you know, so I can't take her too seriously.
Are those babies white as soon as they're hatched?
Actually, they're gray. Now and then you'll get a trumpeter swan baby that hatches that's pure white. Okay? They look, and the picture maybe has just a little more sun on them. Actually, they're a light gray. If you saw them, you'd note that they were a light gray. Some of it's have the lights on them. But every now and then you'll hatch one, about 1 in 1,000 or so. So we haven't seen it, but I've seen pictures of them on the Yellowstone flock where they'll hatch white.
I think it's interesting. I have a pair of the Canada geese that just stick right with those swans. I just thought they chased them away, but they're right with them all the time. Even if they go up in the field and eat,
well, and that's,
they'll go up there with them and eat.
and when I say swans are just like people, it's like, you know, you've met a pair of swans and they're telling you who they are. And so I'm at their mercy.
Maybe it's because they're actually not nesting at this point.
I think
that's why they're tolerating them.
I think that could well be, because on spring gathering areas, just like on fall migratory gathering areas, the swans typically aren't territorial. We've had many swans in the same place in the wintertime. But once they've said, hey, this is my place to nest, why usually then the aggression starts. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But if they are so territorial, that might help to spread them. Because then if they are young swans, you have to look for another pond.
Yes, and that's true. Being territorial does help to disperse the birds.
In Germany,
that's true.
Frankfurt, where I come from, the river was so dirty, it was black, and there was nothing. Finally, they cleaned up the river, and the swans returned by themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a slogan that kind of goes with that movie, Field of Dreams, you know, build it and they will come. And with wetlands, that's, as you've seen, you know, all this work that I go to...
That's in my book, I wrote that. If you build it, they will come.
Yes, and so you're so fortunate, but you've created wonderful habitat and the birds show up.
And they don't even care if it was developed by a bulldozer.
No, they don't care. No, that's for sure. That's for sure. And I think in terms of trumpeter swan habitat, you have created an ideal, because you've got a pond with deep water and open water. Trumpeter swans like that. They like to feed on aquatic vegetation that grows submerged, and all that moss you talked about.
They have their heads
yes.
all the time eating.
Yes, and the moss you talked about that overtook your pond there, swans will be very good to keep that in check. They might not be able to keep up with it, just one pair, but they'll certainly work on it.
I have a lot of other ducks down there too.
Okay.
I probably counted a dozen different kinds of ducks down there last week.
Yeah. Well, the swans, if they decided to stay and you're raising, those little swans, they just start, they just sit in your hand. You don't know what soft is until you've held a newly hatched trumpeter swan cygnet. You don't. He's got this size and he's got no weight. He's just a cotton ball, But they have to grow from that until they're up to, maybe 15, 16 pounds by October so they can migrate. So they eat like crazy. And so that, if you have a nesting pair, they will help a lot in terms of vegetation in your pond where you've got too much for it. And they'll love that open water. They like the edge effect, and they like open water with submerged vegetation really better than the cattails. So.
Well, there are cattails down at the other end.
Yeah, well, that's good too, and they'll work them some too, as far as that goes, which is a good thing generally. I mean, cattails have a tendency to get pretty rank, so if you've got a few muskrat and swans and geese working on them, it kind of keeps them in bounds. So that works well. But yeah, a deep water area, a shallow water area, nesting island. If I was a trumpeter swan, I'd come to your house, and obviously those two have. So you've done very well. You've done very well.